Hello, it's Alister McGrath again, and we're now in the final of our series of 8 presentations on C.S. Lewis. I want to look at some aspects of his approach to suffering. As I noted in an earlier presentation, one of the most attractive and winsome themes in C.S. Lewis's thought is his insistence that Christianity offers an imaginatively rich and rationally satisfying big picture of life. It makes sense of what we observe around us and experience within us. And Lewis took particular pleasure in comparing Christian faith to a rising sun. Just as a sun illuminates the landscaping, allowing us to see things that were otherwise hidden in darkness, so God casts light on a dark world. So what about the existence of suffering and pain in the world? Surely that raises some difficult questions, and Lewis would agree. However, he begins by pointing out there are limits to our understanding. We just can't take everything in. Our minds are too small, the world is too big and too dark. And there are bound to be areas of mystery like the far side of a mountain glacier where the sun never manages to penetrate. We cannot expect the crystalline clarity of visions that writers of the bygone age of reason seem to have expected in every aspect of life. Christianity brings things into sharper focus than anything else. But that does not mean everything comes into sharp focus. It does not mean that everything is brightly illuminated. The shadowlands are still there, patches of darkness or fog that the rising sun never fully illuminates. For most Christians, I think the area of their faith that causes intellectual and emotional discomfort is suffering. Surely there's something wrong here. Why does God allow it? When Lewis returned to Oxford University after the end of the First World War to resume his studies, he was a battle-hardened atheist. His body was permanently scarred with shrapnel wounds. Still deeper, however, were wounds inflicted on his soul. And Lewis, of course, at this time was cynical about religion and dismissive of belief in God. But his atheism began to crumble. And by 1930, Lewis had experienced a reconversion, grasping the full imaginative and rational power of Christianity. So, how did Lewis's new way of seeing things affect the way in which he understood pain and suffering? Let's look at the first engagement of this question in The Problem of Pain, which was written at the beginning of the Second World War in the year 1940. A fear of bombing of British cities at this time led to the imposition of a blackout at night. And cities like Oxford were just plunged into complete darkness so they could not be seen from the air, and of course couldn't be seen from the ground either. All the street lights were turned off, and homes were fitted with blinds to prevent any light from escaping. The result was cities at night were dark, and Lewis suggested that the life of faith is like walking at night in a wartime blackout. We don't see anything clearly. There isn't enough light. But, and I quote from Lewis, the blackout is not quite complete. There are chinks. At times we glimpse the bigger picture, which reassures us that there is a hidden order and deeper structure behind what we see and experience. Now, pain and suffering may make the world appear to be irrational. But for Lewis, every now and then there is a chink in the blackout blind, and we can see further. We discover that an unattainable ecstasy, to use Lewis's phrase, has hovered just beyond our reach, creating a longing for this better world, which is heightened still further by suffering and pain. And for Lewis, yes, the world may at times seem to be meaningless, because that's because we live in a darkened world and cannot see with complete clarity. We are frail, and there are limits to our vision. One day, Lewis argues, things will become clear to us, including the place of suffering within creation. And in the meantime, we must be patient and ask what we can learn from this. How can suffering help us to become better people? Now, those were Lewis's views back in 1940. But the death of Lewis's wife, Joy Davidman, from cancer in 1960, 20 years later, seems to have alerted him to the weaknesses of the very cerebral rationalist approach to suffering we find in The Problem of Pain. And his experience of grief led him to write one of his most distressing and disturbing books, A Grief Observed, published in 1961. And A Grief Observed is basically an edited version of 4 notebooks in which Lewis kept an uncensored and unrestrained journal of his feelings following his wife's death. And Lewis seems to have found that his earlier approach in the problem of pain, like thinking of suffering as God's megaphone to wake up the world, seemed a little bit simplistic and inadequate in the light of the suffering and death of his wife. Now, A Grief Observed describes what Lewis regards as a process of testing, not a testing of God, but a testing of Lewis himself. Listen to what Lewis says. God has not been trying an experiment on my faith or love in order to find out their quality. He knew it already. It was I who didn't. And Lewis' journal records his thoughts as he explored every option in the face of the suffering. Maybe God wasn't there. Maybe God was a tyrant. Lewis wanted to raise and explore these possibilities thoroughly and honestly. And in the end, he rejected them. In the end, A Grief Observed is a narrative of the testing and maturing of faith, not simply its recovery, and certainly not its loss. Now, interestingly, there's a clear tipping point in Lewis's thinking. It comes when Lewis wishes he had been allowed to suffer instead of his wife. And Lewis believed, he got this idea from Charles Williams, that the mark of a true lover was a willingness to take on pain and suffering in order that the beloved might be spared its worst. And then Lewis realized, isn't that actually what God did on the cross? Didn't Christ suffer on behalf of others so that they might be spared its pain? God could bear suffering, and God did bear that suffering. The image of the crucified Christ, so familiar to us through the work of Renaissance artists, seemed to resolve Lewis's deepest anxiety about God's apparent absence and indifference. Maybe imaginative contemplation of the crucified Christ might help us more than rational dissection of the notion of God's omnipotence here. Lewis makes the important point that Christ's suffering and death shatters inadequate ideas of God. Listen to these words from A Grief Observed. My idea of God is not a divine idea. It has to be shattered time after time. He shatters it himself. He is the great iconoclast. Could we not almost say that this shattering is one of the marks of his presence? The incarnation is a supreme example. It leaves all previous ideas of the Messiah in ruins. And Lewis here makes the point that our perception that suffering is an intellectual problem partly results from our preconceived idea of what God is like. We need to hold on to a Christ who suffers, just as the suffering Christ holds on to us. In reflecting on the crucified Christ, we are reminded that God entered into the world to bear suffering. It's not something that lies beyond the experience or the presence of God. Although Lewis initially saw Christianity primarily as a way of making sense of the world, he gradually came to see it also as helping him to cope with its sorrow and pain. 3 years after the death of his wife, Lewis realized he himself was dying, and this seems to have prompted him to reflect more deeply on the meaning of Christ's resurrection in relation to pain and suffering. And in some of his letters written during the final months of his own illness, Lewis spoke of the hope he had in the face of death. And maybe some lines from The Last Battle, the final novel of the Chronicles of Narnia series, capture this point especially well. And Lewis puts these words into the mouth of Jewel the unicorn. I've come home at last. This is my real country. I belong here. This is the land I've been looking for all my life, though I never knew it till now. Now, there's much more needs to be said about Lewis's ideas and suffering, just as much more needs to be said about just about everything about Lewis. But in this series of short presentations, I've opened up only a few of his ideas, and I hope I've persuaded you they deserve closer attention. So where should we go next in these presentations? Well, as you know, I used to be an atheist before I discovered Christianity at Oxford in 1971. And in the next set of presentations, I want to talk about why I moved from atheism to Christianity. I've called this series The Island of Faith, and it tells you about my growing doubts about my teenage atheism, my discovery of Christianity at Oxford University, and then my exploration of its ideas. And I use the image of discovering and exploring a strange island to look at these big questions of science, faith, and doubt. I think you'll find this really interesting, and I look forward to speaking to you again very soon.